I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Colm A. Kelleher. Since obtaining his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Dublin Trinity College, Colm has spent 35 years of his working life in a wide variety of diverse careers. Between 91 and 96, he was an immunology research scientist at the National Jewish Center in Denver. Between 96 and 2004, Colm led the National Institute for Discovery Science team on Skinwalker Ranch, as well as multiple other NIDS projects. From 2004 to 2008, he served as the lab director at the San Francisco biotech company Prozetta, and in 2008, he became the deputy administrator of Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, where he led the day-to-day operations in executing the AAWSAP contract, the Defense Intelligence Agency. From 2012 to 2020, Colm led the Environmental Control and Life Support Systems Department at Bigelow Aerospace, where he managed 11 separate projects that cumulatively resulted in the building of life support systems for expandable spacecraft in low Earth orbit. He is the author of Brain Trust in 2004, co-author of The Hunt for Skinwalker in 2005 with award-winning journalist George Knapp, and of Skinwalkers at the Pentagon in 2021 with George Knapp and James Lakatsky. So Colm, welcome, sir. Today we are talking about Skinwalker Ranch and the UAP mystery. This is the focus of your two books. So let me start with the first book, The Hunt for Skinwalker, which came out back in 2005. Let me start out by asking, what kind of response have you had to that book in the 17 years since publication?
Yeah, it seems like a lot of time has gone past since the publication of that book. Yeah, 17 years. But our original intent on writing that book was in order to gather more information about whether or not there were centers of concentrated UFO activity around the United States and beyond the United States. That was the original motivation for George Knapp and myself to write that book. So in the intervening time, it has become obvious that there is a lot of different UFO centers of activity everywhere from like Yakima, Washington. We actually investigated Dulce, New Mexico. Chris O'Brien and other people have investigated the San Luis Valley in Colorado. Then there's numerous hotspots out on the east coast of the United States. Hessdalen and Fjord in Norway, and then Perm in Russia are two other examples that are outside the United States. But there's a lot of different places that we've sort of come up against since the publication of that book. And it really did sort of cement the idea that the Skinwalker Ranch and Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah were not, special, quote unquote. The only thing special about them was that there was a continuous boots on the ground presence and monitoring surveillance equipment starting in 1996. But, there were boots on the ground from 1994. The ranching family that took control of Skinwalker Ranch back in 1994. So between 1994 and to this very day, there has been a continuous presence on Skinwalker Ranch, and multiple different teams, multiple origin of members of those teams are all saying the same thing. I mean, they've all experienced variations on the same theme of anomalous phenomena. So between 1994 and now is almost 30 years.
Yeah, it's intriguing. I've done a lot on the Nimitz case, right? And Catalina Island is another hotspot where, for some reason, it seems like it's tied to that particular geography. So
yes, yeah, Catalina Island, and so yeah, the the AAWSAP case, or the AAWSAP team, were the first sort of people to sort of stumble on this incredible case of the one that you just mentioned, the Tic Tac case from 2004, because in 2008, November 2008, I was going through a process of rapid fire interviewing people for the newly fledged OSAP contract, which had just been let in September of 2008. So in November 2008, this lieutenant colonel walked into my office, and I was interviewing him for a program manager position. Turned out that his resume and his whole interview went really well. So I had already decided to hire him, and I was just about to call Robert Bigelow to say, we have our first major program manager, when he sort of dropped this bombshell on me. He said that, he was actually an F-18 pilot. He was flying off the Nimitz aircraft carrier in 2004. And then he went through this whole incident of being vectored in, where the team of F-18 fighters encountered this Tic Tac. And at that time, literally nobody, except a very, very small group of pilots, knew about this incident. This was all the way back in November of 2008. So obviously, he was already on board. So we got more details from him in the ensuing month or so. I got Robert Bigelow and myself got on the phone to the Defense Intelligence Agency with James Lakatsky, and James Lakatsky contacted the guy we call Axelrod in our book. And Axelrod's name is allegedly leaking at the moment of who he really is, but I'm not going to use his real name because part of the deal for writing this book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, was to keep his name secret. Yeah. So if he wants to, reveal himself, that's obviously up to him, but I'm not going to do that. So anyway, Axelrod put a team together and started interviewing all of the Tic Tac pilots, Dave Fravor and all of his colleagues. So back in 2008, really nobody knew about this Tic Tac case. And Axelrod put together a 15-page summary report that essentially said that the Tic Tac, from interviewing all of the pilot witnesses, the people who were manning the radar on the Princeton, and many other staff people, the bottom line was that the Tic Tac was not, quote unquote, ours. It was from, an unknown origin, but it was not ours. It was not a United States asset. And it was unlikely to be a Chinese asset or a Russian asset also. So his report was delivered to the Defense Intelligence Agency in July of 2009. And that was 8 years before the New York Times broke the story, this bombshell story in December of 2017 about this incident. And Dave Fravor actually came forward and sort of participated in that whole process.
Yeah. Well, let me go off my questions list, and I'll ask yourself and the audience to forgive me because sometimes I get lost when I do that. That's why I pre-write them. But in terms of the UAP phenomena, do you think that they're extraterrestrial? You have as much knowledge for as long as anybody on this, and you have this depth, I guess, of research. I mean, right now in Congress, they keep citing, the potential for foreign powers, but how foreign, right? I mean, I guess that's what it comes down to.
Well, I know for a fact from, speaking with Axelrod and his colleagues and many, many others who have access to a lot of the special access programs in the United States inventory in the past. And all of the people that I've spoken with have basically said, look, they're not ours. If you take that as a fact, the fact that they're not ours, it is highly unlikely that Russian and or Chinese. I would caveat that. Now, I'm talking specifically about the Tic Tac incident here.
Yeah.
Because we went into depth on that incident. So I'm not really fully read up on all of the different incidents that have happened with many of the aircraft carriers off both the East and West Coast since 2004. But I can tell you that the Tic Tac 2004 incident was not ours. Where did it come from? right now we have no idea. I mean, it's a technology of unknown origin. So these UAPs, and there are many incidents where these objects are identified as of unknown origin. They're not ours, and you know, it's pure speculation to ask whether they're extraterrestrials, interdimensionals, cryptoterrestrials. You know, I mean, there's the list of hypotheses is endless, but the fact is there is not sufficient data out there, certainly in the public, that will come down in favor of extraterrestrial versus interdimensional.
Yeah. Well, it seems like emotionally speaking, I think all of us are in a process of acceptance, right? And I say emotionally
Right.
because, you know, intellectually I've run through this, right? I mean, I'm familiar with Chinese and, you know, Russian Air Force and where their technology level is. And I'm looking at this going, there's no way, you know, but emotionally, it's really difficult to accept that it could be something beyond, right? Like extraterrestrial or potentially you mentioned interdimensional or who knows what, you know, but I would imagine that the majority of the public is in the same boat. And you know, you always have a small group of early adopters, people who are really excited about this, who say, yes, this is what we've been waiting for. But I think for the rest of us, it's kind of like, okay, I don't see anything other than these really difficult to accept explanations, but that doesn't make them any easier to accept, you know.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's a process that's a very slow sort of awakening that happens with an individual when they certainly when they come across data or somebody briefs them on something that is, you know, obviously real, quote unquote, and so you know the acceptance process does take a while. I went through sort of a version of that all the way back on one of my first forays on Skinwalker Ranch when
Yeah.
I came face to face with something that came right over Skinwalker Ridge. It was at night in November of 2008, and this low-flying, brightly lit object that was traveling really quickly, like jet fighter quickly, came right over me and did a perfect 180-degree turn right over my head, and then went right back, retraced its path right over Skinwalker Ranch or Skinwalker Ridge. So it was completely silent, and obviously it's very difficult to assess altitude during the night, but it happened so quickly. But the absolute spooky silence and the really rapid hairpin turn, 180-degree turn, convinced me that this was something that I'd never seen before. I mean, it was a moment of sort of you know, my jaw dropped because, you know, I was standing in the middle of nowhere, you know, complete silence. I mean, there's no cars on the road or any of that stuff. It's complete silence. So there was no background noise whatsoever. And there was nothing, no sound whatsoever from this object. Now, I don't know if it was a toy from Hill Air Force Base or whatever, but it certainly caught my attention as being something I had never experienced before, and so that really sort of started I guess an acceptance that, you know, there is possibly really advanced technology out here.
Mm. Well, so that was one of the first encounters that you had. What were some of the others? I mean, you studied at Skinwalker Ranch, you did research and you studied these phenomena for years. I mean, and now I've heard, again, we've all heard stories, right? Stories about potential portals. You know, someone had talked about beings. I guess there were cattle mutilations, lots of UFOs. All sorts of just basically this cluster of strange events. What were some of the things that you saw personally while you were there?
Well, one of the sort of, again, I found it disturbing was we were standing down in, and this was happened in the summer of 1997, which is again going all the way back there. But summer of 1997, myself and this other scientist were standing out in the middle of Skinwalker Ranch at a location that we used to call Homestead Number 2, which is an old abandoned cottage that is really sort of probably close to 100 years old, long since abandoned, but still on the property. But that particular long, narrow pasture had been the site of a lot of different phenomena that had been seen by the NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science team, since being on the property. We basically started this investigation in late September of 1996. So this was summer 1997, and various things had happened. We had it, one of our investigators had photographed some weird lights that were flying around inside the this old abandoned homestead. So myself and this other scientist were parked outside the park by standing with two dogs outside this this abandoned homestead in the pasture, when about probably, I guess, somewhere between 50 yards and maybe 80 yards to my left, this object suddenly appeared in the pasture. It was probably the size of a basketball, and it blinked on, sort of came out of nowhere, just blinked on suddenly. It was floating maybe 15 feet off the ground, and it was silent, completely silent. It moved around a bit. It had a bluish tint to it. And we, both myself and this other guy, were looking at it. The dogs that were with us were looking at it, wondering what the hell it was. Then after a few seconds, it just suddenly vanished. We don't know if it moved at, faster than the human eye can match, or if it just blinked out. But we had some very expensive at the time and very bulky, law enforcement flashlights. The batteries of these things weighed almost 10 pounds. I mean, it was this is back in the 90s. Well, anyway, we flashed both of these flashlights on, lit up the entire pasture, actually lit up everywhere for miles around. And there was really no sign of anything. I mean, one hypothesis was somebody was kind of playing tricks on us from the other field. We could see all around us, and there was really nothing. There was nothing that could have caused this spherical object to be in the pasture right beside us. So that was really convincing, to me, because it wasn't sort of 2 miles in the distance behind a bunch of trees. It was right in the same pasture. There were no trees between us and this object. And it was, 15 feet off the ground. It wasn't sort of, several thousand feet up. So it was kind of in your face. And that was the start of a sort of a whole series of events that happened in that same pasture that I was a part of. It was pretty routine for the team, the NIDS team, or security officers that were patrolling the property, to see these baseball-sized objects that were brightly lit. They would be moving around that seemed like they were under intelligent control, and some of them came pretty close too. So a lot of that was happening in 1997. But well, it's not only sort of these orbs of light and all of that that's associated with Skinwalker Ranch. I mean, Skinwalker Ranch, I think, has this reputation as a paranormal laboratory, where all this weird stuff happens, all these bizarre creatures. But fact is, the ground sort of truth phenomena that originally started, but what we call the Gorman family, that were on the property until 1996, saw nuts and bolts craft flying around the pasture. My sighting of this object that came right over me it looked to me like a smallish jet fighter sized object that was completely silent, but it wasn't a sort of bizarre phenomenon. It looked like, to me, even though I saw enough resolution behind this light to indicate that there was structure behind this thing. This was not just a ball of light. It had structure behind it, and during the AAWSAP program, one of the main investigators from the Defense Intelligence Agency that was put on the property specifically to corroborate these stories. So he actually saw and photographed what looked like a metallic object. And I know since Robert Bigelow sold the property in March of 2016, and Brandon Fugel has taken over, his team and he himself has reported, these metallic objects. So, that the ground truth phenomena on Skinwalker Ranch and surrounding Skinwalker Ranch are these objects, these metallic-like objects, or what look like metallic objects. And then surrounding all of this is this, bizarre litany of unusual phenomena, poltergeist activity, paranormal phenomena.
Yeah. Well, now do you think that these could be the same objects as the quote unquote Tic Tac? And the reason I ask is you described kind of a bigger craft and then smaller orb-like craft or observation platforms or something. And that reminds me of the Tic Tac itself. I think they said it looked like a giant propane tank. It was around the size of a small fighter jet. The USS Kidd encounter, and I believe again that was off Catalina Island, they talked about smaller orbs doing what looked like observation on the ship. And there was even a story that they were trying to use a rope gun to snag some of them because they were so close. Do you think that these could be the same craft, if you could call them that?
I honestly don't know. I mean, all of the objects that we documented during the National Institute for Discovery Science program, they were a sort of a large variety of sizes and shapes. In addition, it's pretty well known now that the surrounding areas of Skinwalker Ranch also has been host to a lot of UFO activity and a lot of unusual activity. In fact, there was a science teacher at the local high school in the Uinta Basin who in 1950 started collecting stories from people from people in the locale regarding what their sightings were. And he accumulated 400 separate documentation and descriptions of these objects, these UFO objects. Now, he was the first to explain that he eliminated a lot of the quote unquote weird stuff that was happening in addition to these UFOs. He focused only on these objects that looked like they were solid and they looked like they were metallic, nuts and bolts kinds of objects. But between 1950 and the 1990s, he had accumulated 400 cases, and none of these were sort of lights in the sky or, distant stuff. A lot of these cases were, daylight sightings of metallic looking objects. So the Uinta Basin itself we're now looking at what, 50 and 20, we're now looking at 73-year history of a lot of UFO activity in this area. And, that's why it's kind of so well studied. The Skinwalker Ranch happens to be a very well studied, very small portion, 500-acre portion of that large Uinta Basin that has this 70-year history of very intensive activity. And, part of what we did during the NIDS era and also during the AAWSAP era was to start interviewing neighbors, in a radius around the ranch. And sort of over the years, we accumulated a lot of data, both during the NIDS and during the AAWSAP era. And, it turned out the Skinwalker Ranch activity, once you got the neighbors comfortable with talking to you, and this may happen after the second visit or the third visit or the fourth visit, but eventually once they got comfortable with talking with you, they were willing to open up, and they talked about poltergeist activity. They talked about bizarre creatures, that whole thing. But the initial interviews were usually very, very slim on information. And it was only when you gained their trust that they started opening up about. And, my sort of sensing, having spent a lot of time in Dulce, New Mexico, where we experienced exactly the same thing. The first interviews were always about this sort of disc-shaped object that was, seen in daylight by these Native Americans in Dulce. But, after revisiting, we were lucky to have access to the tribe, the Icarilla Apache tribe in Dulce, New Mexico, for several years. And they started talking about unusual activity that seemed to be associated with these objects. So I think the longer you're willing to go back and the more time you're willing to spend with these witnesses, and as they get more and more comfortable, they are willing to sort of talk about stuff that is absurd and difficult to believe and bizarre. And, most people legitimately are afraid they will not be taken seriously. So they don't tend to talk about this stuff during the first interview.
Yeah. The stigma is very real, right? And
yeah.
I think that's, again, I think with what's going on in Congress right now, I think they are finally starting to overcome the stigma, and that's necessary to understand whatever is happening, on any level. So I think that's a wonderful step forward. Now, I should ask, are these events mostly benign? You mentioned cattle mutilations. And, again, there are so many stories, I guess, that have come out of that area. Could you tell me a little bit about those? I guess the reason I'm pausing is, I think most folks have seen photos on the internet. And in terms of stuff like cattle mutilations, they talk about, well, it could be wolves, it could be bears. Again, there's a psychological reasoning behind it, right? But then some of those photos, it looks like the cows have been cut with some kind of a laser or something like that. Did you guys see anything like that? Or
well, the National Institute for Discovery Science, back in 1996, actually hired a DVM PhD, a veterinarian pathologist, specifically to start looking into this phenomenon, because our logic there was that these phenomena seem to be, these so-called cattle mutilations seem to be in some way associated with reports of unusual lights in the sky during that same period of time. So we hired a DVM PhD to start conducting necropsies on these animals once they were reported to us. And over the years, we established a lot of rapport on the west side of the United States with, we had a group of law enforcement officers who were willing to pick up the phone. Once the farmer contacted them, they were willing to pick up the phone. We got on a really fast plane and got there. The veterinarian would do these necropsies, and then we would send these samples to histopathology labs, biochemical chemistry, and chemical analysis. So, long story short, we investigated several dozen, probably 60 to 70 separate cases in the western part of the United States, everywhere from Montana to South Dakota to California, New Mexico. We spent a lot of time in New Mexico, a lot of time in Utah, some in Colorado. So, long story short, we documented that there were sharp instruments used on these animals. This was not predator activity. Now, some of the quote unquote mutilations that we came upon that were reported to us were pretty obviously predators. I mean, there's a very fundamental difference between what used to be called cattle mutilations and this predator activity. When a predator attacks a cow, there's usually a lot of entrails and a lot of blood scattered around. It's a very sort of messy, nasty looking scene,
Yeah.
where you know the stomach and the intestines are strewn around the ground. However, these cattle mutilations, in some cases we documented, there was not a drop of blood on the animal, in the animal, underneath the animal, and the rear end of the animal was cut with what looked like sharp instruments. We actually cut the areas around these cuts and sent them to these histopathology labs, who validated that sharp instruments were used, some form of a scalpel or something, you know, something sharp that was capable of cutting through hide. So we were, you know, we were absolutely certain after the NIDS program ended, having investigated, like I said, 60 to 70 of these cases, that there was sharp instruments used on this animal, and that predators and scavengers was not the explanation. Now, it's really intriguing that over the decades, nobody has been caught or charged. You know, this has been going on since the late 1960s. Not a single individual has been caught or charged for these crimes. You know, I mean, killing these animals on you know, private land is a crime. So
Yeah.
you know, not a single person has been caught or charged. There was an FBI sort of task force put together in the late 1970s that looked into this in terms of some of the cases in New Mexico, some of the cases in Colorado, but they really never came to a definitive conclusion, and they looked at too few cases. It was, but I mean, it's an intriguing phenomenon. We still don't know whether or not this has anything whatsoever to do with the so-called UFO phenomenon. The reason that we focused on it was that there was a dead body in the pasture that was amenable to forensic analysis, and we could do, you know, biological analysis, we could do chemical analysis, and we did tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of chemical analysis on these animals, as well as histopathology. But we still don't know what the tie-in, if any, was to this so-called UFO phenomenon.
Interesting. Well, again, the work that you did, and so I want to go to your second book now, because the work that you did at NIDS, right? And we've talked about UFOs, cattle mutilations, strange lights. I mean, just this collection of phenomena. This led to the AAWSAP program, and that's what you describe in your new book, Skinwalkers in the Pentagon. And that came out, you published that in 2021.
Right.
And you wrote that along with Dr. James Lekatsky, and I think that started when he visited Skinwalker Ranch 2007, right? So,
well, it's interesting. It actually started when he read a copy of Hunt for the Skinwalker in early 2007. And one of his colleagues, the guy we call Axelrod in the book, was also part of the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time. And he was being seconded to Iraq right around that time. So Lekatsky gave him his copy of Hunt for the Skinwalker. And so Axelrod, when he was in the Green Zone in Baghdad, basically passed around the copy of Hunt for the Skinwalker around the swimming pool in the Green Zone in Baghdad. And so he told me later, you know, I got to know him pretty well. He told me later that it was one of the more popular books around the swimming pool in the Green Zone in Baghdad. But, you know, that was sort of one of the sort of stimuli that caused Lekatsky to write a letter to Robert Bigelow, because Lekatsky's thinking was, you know, here we have these stories of a lot of stuff flying around the airspace above the Uinta Basin and around Utah, and we don't know where they're from. They could be from foreign adversaries. We have no idea. So they constitute a potential threat. So his idea in contacting Robert Bigelow was to initiate some kind of a dialogue regarding potential threat analysis of what was going on in the airspace around Utah. And these objects were flying around without without any intervention from Air Force or any other armed forces. So they were essentially free to fly around like as if nothing was intervening. So Lakatsky's idea was that this was a potential threat, and so he contacted Robert Bigelow. Robert Bigelow invited him to visit Skinwalker Ranch. And so over a very short period of time, when Lakatsky was on the property, he was standing inside the ranch manager's house when Robert Bigelow was chatting to the two ranch managers. And behind them, Lakatsky saw this bizarre looking object that seemed to appear, out of thin air. And this sort of had a very dramatic effect on him. He sort of didn't say anything to anybody about it. He just internalized it, but it was something that only he saw, and it was a sort of a curved metallic object that seemed to be shrouded in a yellowish cloud, and it had literally just appeared in the kitchen behind the two ranch managers and Robert Bigelow. He was looking at this sort of gobsmacked. He looked away, looked back, and it was still there. So it was not sort of a trick of the light or a trick of his imagination. It was there, and then the object disappeared. But as I said, Lakatsky didn't say anything about that. But later on, he contacted Robert Bigelow, and sort of through multiple steps, working very closely together with Senator Harry Reid, who is since deceased, a program was put together called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Application Program, or AAWSAP. $22 million was allocated over a 24-month period, and this money was funneled through the Defense Intelligence Agency. So the program manager of the program was Dr. Lakatsky in Washington. I was the program manager in Las Vegas, Nevada, reporting to Robert Bigelow, who's the CEO of this new organization that was formed to execute this AAWSAP program. So my task was to essentially hire staff. So within a very short period of time, we had hired about 50 full-time staff. This was over about a 7-month period. We had PhD level scientists, we had master's degree scientists, we had engineers, we had database analysts, we had translators because we were getting documents from different countries. So the AAWSAP program, expanded very, very rapidly. And, part of the whole thing was to have boots on the ground in a rapid reaction team that was trained to hop on a plane in response to a report of a UFO in some part of the country. And by the way, we also had 2 MD PhDs on our staff that were cleared up to TSSCI level. So they were physician scientists who were able to fly to anywhere in the country to investigate medical effects of UFO interactions with people. And we had a couple of cases that we describe in the book of where people got injured as a result of close encounters with these unidentified flying objects. There was one guy he was a biotechnologist driving just south of Bend, Oregon. And he had his teenage daughter in the car with him. Out of the corner of their eye, they saw these 3, what looked like bright blue flying objects that were darting around this pasture right beside the road as they were driving towards Bend. And once they saw them, these objects came right towards the car at a high rate of speed. So it seemed like these flying objects, these unidentified flying objects, were heading straight for the car. It turned out that one of them went right across the windshield of the car in front of them. One of them came through the window and flew right across the driver and the passenger. And then the third one came in and penetrated the left shoulder of the driver and went through his body and exited his right shoulder right in front of his daughter, who saw it just fly right across out through the window. So this guy, by the evening, started feeling really nauseous. And he started a lot of different physiological effects. He had a metallic taste in his mouth. He didn't sleep very well. He had these bizarre nightmares during that time. Within a few days, he had this sunburn all down the left side of his face where the object had come in his left shoulder. He started losing hearing in his left ear. His left eye started really tearing up, and sort of he couldn't see properly out of it. And he went to the doctor. Within a week or so, the hair from his head started falling out. So there was a whole bunch of sequelae that happened to this object, this unidentified flying object that essentially flew right through his body in the upper thoracic cavity.
That sounds like radiation poisoning, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, there were a lot of the symptoms that he had they seem to have overlap with radiation effects. The hair loss, metallic taste, had extreme nausea, and all of that. It ended up sort of several months later, he came down with a rare form of ductal carcinoma that was luckily in situ, so it was not metastatic. So he was eventually able to be treated. But that was an example where our physician scientist was able to be on the spot for this person and walk through the multiple months of blood samples and all of that. So this case became a very highly documented medical injury case associated with unidentified flying objects. I mean, these objects were unknown. They were flying around the place, so they were unidentified. And eventually this guy recovered, but it took a long time. Now, the interesting thing about it was the daughter didn't have any medical effects that were, obvious at the time. But she went back to the East Coast to college. She was sharing a house with roommates. But after her return, a plethora of paranormal and poltergeist activity erupted in the household, where the roommates were reporting all these weird, dark, humanoid shapes, standing over them in the bed.
You had mentioned that. In fact, I believe you called them hitchhikers, and that was something that was supposed to affect just people in this area in general, right? These strange phenomena happen, and the idea is that it sticks with people, I guess.
Yeah, well, in the daughter's case, she was right beside her father when this whole thing happened. She didn't have any medical issues that we could determine, but it could have been total coincidence. But right after she went back home on the East Coast, and I think it was Connecticut, where she had eruptions of these bizarre activities. Now, that's an example of the hitchhiker effect, but we on Skinwalker Ranch, this was very, very common, particularly with the people that the Defense Intelligence Agency sent out to Skinwalker Ranch to validate what was going on. So, during the initial stages of the project, obviously, they were going to send experienced people out to the property to reconnoiter the Skinwalker Ranch and assess and evaluate whether or not there was any truth to these stories that they had read about in Hunt for the Skinwalker, or that they had heard from other people. So every single one of those, in total, there were 5 people that were on the property at different times from the Defense Intelligence Agency. All 5 of them encountered unusual activity on the property. They reported unusual activity on the property. But even worse than that, when they went back to their homes in Maryland and Virginia, their homes became really active with poltergeist activity. Their children, especially, and also their spouses, started reporting unusual, this weird, unusual phenomena in the house. Sometimes they would see black shadows in the teenagers. The teenagers would wake up and there would be a black shadow over the bed, kind of thing. Very scary stuff. There would be orbs flying through the house, these small baseball-sized objects were flying through the house. That was very common. And sometimes, they were associated with extreme stress in these teenagers because they didn't know at all what the hell was going on. They had never experienced this kind of activity. And suddenly, after Axelrod was one of them, after Axelrod got home, it was like his house became a paranormal Disneyland. And his wife and kids were exposed to a lot of bizarre activity.
Yeah. Well, and so I think, to me at least, this seems to answer this question that a lot of people have. Are UAPs, are UFOs, is this ours? Is this something that comes out of, some lab somewhere, some kind of a US secret project? This doesn't sound like ours. It doesn't sound like ours in any way, shape, or form.
No, I mean, I know, going back to the Tic Tac incident, that I think we did, and Axelrod and his team, and all of the people who have closely examined the Tic Tac incident, I think the majority of people who are on the inside will be basically able to tell you that these are not ours. And they're unlikely to be either Russian or Chinese technology. It's just the performance characteristics of this Tic Tac that was pretty well visually documented and then also documented with a lot of instruments is far beyond what is possible for the the current known United States assets.
Yeah. Well, and I know we're running low on time. I'd like to ask briefly about how AAWSAP became AATIP, I guess. I think that's something I should probably cover. So again, the AAWSAP program, this was something through the Bigelow organization that you were working on.
Right.
And then eventually that got handed off to AATIP, and that was the one that Lou Elizondo was in charge of. And that it basically is how things kind of went public when they leaked some of the details, and of course those 3 videos. So
yeah, so the AAWSAP program was originally going to be a 5-year program. So at the end of the 24-month period, we were notified, close to the end of the 24-month period, we were notified that the Defense Intelligence Agency wanted to shut it down. So they gave us a 3-month no-cost extension in order to move beyond that. So at the end of the 27-month period, the AAWSAP program had delivered close to 100 separate technical reports regarding UFO performance and activity, both nationally and also internationally. We had deployed investigators in Brazil, for example, and we had multiple reports on that. So at the end of 2010, the AAWSAP program shut down. I'm not aware of the exact transition or what happened, but I do know that I was familiar with Lou Elizondo's name in 2013, 2014, when there was Senator Reid had made possible another tranche of money, and there was negotiations going on with the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence regarding the possibility of a new program initiating at USDI. And Lou Elizondo's name came up several times during that period. So I'm not aware of the exact mechanics of any overlap between AATIP, but I do know, obviously, during the 2017 New York Times unveiling, and when Lou Elizondo unveiled at the TTSA press conference, that whole thing I was aware of, but I was not aware of any the mechanics of any transition between AAWSAP and what later became known as AATIP. I do know that AATIP was used as a cover name for the AAWSAP program when Senator Reid submitted a letter to the Pentagon as a first step in gaining special access program status for the AAWSAP program. And the moniker AATIP was used in that context as a cover to protect the name of AAWSAP. And, AAWSAP was trying to fly below the radar in the Pentagon because, everybody knows that the UFO topic is a pretty toxic subject
Yeah.
And so it is, in many people's views, a career killer. So the exact transition, though, between OSAP and ATIP, I was not aware of that. Myself and Robert Bigelow had finished operations in our, we put in a final year report at the end of December of 2010. And the final payments that we were obviously overseeing from the Defense Intelligence Agency happened in September of 2010. And so all of the funding ceased after that. So I don't know where the funding for ATIP came from. I don't know a lot of the details of what happened with ATIP.
Interesting. Well, Colm, let me thank you so much for your time today. And just this incredible depth and detail of what you've described. Again, the latest book is Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, and you really describe a lot of the material that's in your first book, The Hunt for the Skinwalker, as well as kind of what happened after that. So I guess let me close by asking, when people turn on their TV, they see Brandon Fugel's team out at Skinwalker Ranch doing investigations. Someone had mentioned to me, they said, you should look at what Bigelow is doing. The Bigelow team has moved on to the consciousness, the survival of consciousness after death. Is that something that came out of the work at Skinwalker?
Well, it's interesting, actually. All the way back in the formative stage of the National Institute for Discovery Science, all the way back in 1995, NIDS was actually set up to do two separate missions, one of which was to investigate the survival of consciousness after death. And the second mission of NIDS was to investigate the UFO phenomenon. But the arm of NIDS had a very sterling science advisory board comprising people like Dr. Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, Dr. Bruce Grayson, who was a sort of renowned person in the survival of consciousness after death, Emily Cook. We had other people on our board, all of which were focused on the survival of consciousness after death. However, it quickly became obvious, especially after Robert Bigelow purchased Skinwalker Ranch, that there was just too much. It was like a fire hose of data coming in, and NIDS had to focus, in terms of bandwidth, on the UFO topic. So the survival of consciousness after death actually dates all the way back to 1995, 1996. Okay. So Robert Bigelow, and I've always had an interest in this topic too, and it's I think consciousness affects how UFOs affect consciousness, how UFOs affect perception, which is something we haven't talked about, but which is a very large topic in terms of UFO effects on people, is part of something I'm very interested in, and also any potential overlaps with what happens to human consciousness after people die.
Wonderful. Well, Colm, let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
It's a real pleasure. It was good to talk with you.